In Chapter 6, we start the skeletal system. And we're going to be studying the skeletal system in Chapter 6, Chapter 7, and Chapter 8. Um, and Chapter 6 is titled Bones and Bone Tissue. Most books just call it bone tissue. So we're not really getting into all the different bones and their names and structures on the bones. We're looking more at the tissue level. Um, we're looking at that compact bone versus spongy bone. We're also looking at how bones form and grow. In chapter 7 is when we really start getting into all the different bones of the human skeleton and structures on those bones. And then the following chapter, chapter 8, is joints and movements. So all three of those chapters are all under that skeletal system, organ system. So, as we normally do, let's start with some of the chapter topics. We're going to talk about functions of the skeletal system. Then we're going to talk about how we might classify bones based on their shape. So, that's just one way to classify bones. There's a few different ways, but one way they just kind of categorized them is look at the bone shape. There's 4 or 5 different categories, and you can classify them that way. We're going to pay particular attention to long bones and their structure. So long bones are particularly the ones that are in your arms and legs. So, they're longer than they are wide. So humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula, those are all long bones. But they have certain structure we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the different types of bone cells. In particular, there's 3 different bone cells that all function slightly different in a bone. We get into the compact versus spongy bone comparison. Remember that compact bone is more on the superficial portion of the bone, whereas spongy bone is on the inside. We'll learn about how bones form. So there's a couple different ways to form a bone based on whether it's a long bone or a flat bone. Bone growth in length and width. So there's a couple different processes in order for a bone to grow in length versus width. A really important topic in this chapter is calcium homeostasis. So what that means is, how does the body maintain enough calcium in the bloodstream? Why do we cover that now? Is because bones are a reservoir for calcium. So they can be used if we need more calcium, we can get calcium from them. Or if we have excess calcium, we might deposit it into bones. So bones are very important in calcium homeostasis. And this is where we actually will talk about a couple hormones that are involved in calcium homeostasis. Then we get into factors that affect bone growth and bone health. Basically, what this means is, what do you need for nice, healthy bones? Whether they're still growing, maybe, as a fetus or a child, and even what do we need to keep our bones healthy throughout our entire life. All right, just as an introduction, basic functions of the skeletal system is to protect organs. We have a number of bones that protect our brain. Our vertebral column protects our spinal cord. We've got ribs, sternum that protect organs in our thoracic cavity. So they protect organs. Mineral storage, again, that's kind of what we'll get into when we talk about calcium, but there's also phosphorus that helps maintain storage of minerals. Body movements, so bones act as the levers for muscles. So muscles move bones. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about blood cell production or hematopoiesis. That's the production of blood cells inside bone marrow. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Not much, because we actually get into this more when we get to AMP2 and we learn about blood. Body support. Obviously, bones help support the body. And then bones are actually a site of energy storage. There's actually a adipose inside of our bones. So this drawing doesn't mention that, but there are some triglycerides that are stored inside bone. Okay, let's start with classification of bones based on shape. So 5 basic categories. Long bones, again, bones that are longer than they are wide. Those are all going to be in our appendages, humerus, radius, and ulna. Even the metacarpals and phalanges are long bones. And then in the legs, femur, tibia, fibula, metatarsals, and phalanges in your feet. You could be short. So short bones are, as the name suggests, they're not really long. They're kind of cube shaped. A lot of our short bones are found in the wrists and ankles. All right. So the 8 carpal bones and the 7 tarsals. So you got long, short, flat bones, like the sternum is a flat bone. So are many bones that help form the cranial cavity. Our cranial bones, most of those are flat. Irregular bones, so basically, if it's not long, it's not short, it's not really flat, kind of irregularly shaped, we'll put those in their own category. So the vertebrae are pretty irregular. They've got processes sticking off of them, they've got big bodies, like this structure, so they're irregular. And then the 5th category are called sesamoid bones. Now, sesamoid does refer to sesame, like a sesame seed. And that's because some of these sesamoid bones are pretty small, and they kind of look like sesame seeds. Now, the other kind of definition of a sesamoid bone is it's completely kind of encased inside of a tendon. All right, so your patella or kneecap is the largest sesamoid bone, and it's completely kind of encased in what's known as the quadriceps femoris tendon. All right, we actually have one in our wrist that's a sesamoid bone, and then a lot of times you develop little bones that don't really have names because not everyone has them, but they're usually in a tendon wherever there's a lot of mechanical stress on that tendon. You'll develop a little bit of a bone tissue there. But if you're ever asked about a sesamoid bone, especially in this class, the answer is probably your patella. All right, next topic. Next topic we call structure of a long bone. So we're looking at a long bone. In this case, your book uses the femur. It could just as well be a humerus or a tibia or fibula, but this is any of your long bones. We're looking at different parts to them. First thing we like to do is look at the 2 ends. All right, the ends of the long bones are called epiphyses. That's plural, or an epiphysis. So this would be the proximal, all right, because it's closest to the attachment, which it actually forms the attachment with your hip. All right, so this structure here is known as the proximal epiphysis of this long bone. Here is the distal epiphysis. All right, and typically the epiphyses are going to have cartilage. Notice that this contains some cartilage to protect it, and then down here, this light blue is cartilage to protect that distal end. And if you recall, this cartilage is hyaline cartilage that protects the ends of long bones. You've got the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is the rest, kind of the entire shaft portion of the long bone. All right. And your book doesn't talk about metaphysis, but in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is an area called the metaphysis, but they don't define it in your book, so they only go epiphysis and metaphysis, and diaphysis, sorry. Within the diaphysis, there's a medullary cavity, all right, and that cavity is typically filled with adipose tissue, and the adipose tissue is known as yellow bone marrow. So yellow bone marrow is fat, Red bone marrow, which you find in here in all the spongy bone, that's where you're producing blood cells. All right. What else do we see? We see compact and spongy bone here. So notice the kind of the obvious spongy bone look in here. And then the outer layer is that compact bone. There's a membrane on the outside of the bone called the periosteum. Peri means you surround something, so, kind of think of a perimeter. So it's going to be a membrane that surrounds the perimeter of the bone. So here they're taking a little piece here, and out here, this layer would be the periosteum. All right. That surrounds the outer part of the bone. On the inner part of the bone, there's actually what's called the endosteum. Endo means inside. So this surface would all be covered by an endosteum. Endo meaning inside. And again, unfortunately, your book doesn't show it or point to it here. What else? Here we see the compact bone. If you recall from the tissue chapter, the little units, these cylindrical units, are known as osteons. So osteons are these cylinders that give that compact bone a lot of strength. As we move towards the center of the bone, right, on the inside, you start to see the spongy bone. And inside all these little spaces is where you would find the red bone marrow producing your different blood cells. Bone is an organ, so it's going to have, many tissues. It's got blood. It's a living organ. You got to have blood vessels running throughout the bone tissue. So you see these bone blood cells here. What else? That is it for this slide. So those are structures of a typical long bone. And here's the list. So I think we've covered all these. So diaphysis, the shaft, epiphysis, the ends, periosteum, outer double-layered connective tissue membrane, endosteum, thin connective tissue membrane on the inside. Articular cartilage was that hyaline cartilage. The word articular refers to an articulation, which is a joint. So if you have cartilage at a joint, it's called articular cartilage. So that was that light blue protective covering on the two ends. The epiphyseal plates, I forgot to mention, so we're going to go back in a minute. That's the growth plates. So the epiphyseal plate is a little layer of hyaline cartilage in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, where the bone will grow in length. All right, so we often refer to it as a growth plate. Spongy bone versus compact bone. We got the medullary cavity, red bone marrow, and then yellow bone marrow. So let's go back and point out the epiphyseal plates. So right here, there's one, and right here. So this proximal end of the femur has two growth plates, and that's going to allow this bone to grow in length. There's also going to be one down here that they're not showing. And we'll talk more about these growth plates when we get to how bones grow in length. All right, but you got to have a little cartilage there in order for the bone to grow in length. Once these bones have stopped growing, it's no longer a plate, and it's called an epiphyseal line. So that's how we determine whether someone's bones are still growing or not, is whether they have an epiphyseal plate with cartilage, or if that cartilage is gone, and it's called an epiphyseal line. Okay. Cells. So here again, bone tissue is tissue. It's going to be made up of cells. It's a connective tissue, so there's going to be a lot of extracellular material. But in bones, there's different types of bone cells. And you're going to be asked about these three here. But there are osteogenic cells, which are kind of a stem cell. But stem cells don't really have a job, so we're not going to really talk about those much. But we do want to know the difference between an osteoblast, osteocyte, and osteoclast. Now, they all start with osteo, so that means bone. A cell that ends in blast usually is, actively producing something. So, for example, a fibroblast is actively producing fibers like collagen. A chondroblast is a cell that's actively forming cartilage. An osteoblast is synthesizing the bone matrix. All right, so this is matrix synthesizing cell responsible for bone growth. So these cells form the bone matrix. A lot of times I tell students, think of blast as builders. So these are the bone builders. So they're going to be forming that nice calcium phosphate extracellular material. They eventually kind of mature and they become an osteocyte. So an osteocyte actually used to be an osteoblast. They're not as active, but they still function. They're mature and they kind of maintain the matrix. All right. They're kind of like, I think of them as kind of a manager that just makes sure everything's going, the way it should be, but they're not necessarily building as much as the osteoblasts. Then you have what's called an osteoclast, which is the bone resorbing or bone breaking down cell. So resorbing or resorption of bone is actually dissolving the bone matrix. Now you might say, well, why in the world would you want to do that? And it's so you can kind of refreshen the bone tissue throughout your life. So as your bones grow, right, you need to build bone, obviously. But throughout your entire life, there's a combination of bone building and bone breaking down. So in an effort to kind of make sure that tissue is, nice and healthy. All right. This combination of bone building and bone breaking down throughout your life is called bone remodeling. So remodeling is the ongoing replacement of old bone tissue with new bone tissue. It involves the balance between resorption, which again, resorption is breaking down of bone, okay? And that's done by the osteoclast. And then bone deposition or bone building by the osteoblasts. So this is a balance, okay? And as long as it's balanced, all the bone that you break down, you'll rebuild, which is good. Unfortunately, as we age, starting around the age of 30 or in your 30s, the osteoblasts don't work as hard or as well or as fast as the osteoclasts. So as we age, after the age of 30 or so, you actually get a little more breaking down of bone than you do building of bone. And that can lead to osteoporosis. All right. Now, the shocking thing you should have picked up on is this starts in your 30s. So your bones start to have a slight imbalance in these two processes. So we should be doing everything we can starting earlier in our life to help prevent osteoporosis. Because by the time we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s, it's kind of too late. We're already into this bone, weakening stage. So towards the end of this PowerPoint, we'll talk about some things that you can do to help keep your osteoblasts functioning a little harder for you so you don't develop that osteoporosis. Worst case situation, there are medications. Boniva is kind of a classic drug given to severe osteoporosis in that it will actually slow down those osteoclasts, kind of allow the osteoblasts to keep up. All right, so this slide's got a lot of information. It's got the three major types of cells and what they do. It's got the concept of bone remodeling throughout your life, the balance, and what happens when this is not in balance. It can lead to osteoporosis. We know bones are hard, right? We know bones are made up, of a lot of calcium. and phosphate, and that gives the bones their strength. But bones are also flexible. So bones have to have a little bit of ability to, flex and not just snap. So what gives bones its strength are the minerals. All right. So calcium phosphate is what gives the bones strength. If you were to take away all those minerals, right, dissolve the calcium from this bone, okay, and you can actually do that. What you do is you use acid. So if you were to soak this bone in an acid, it would basically melt away all the calcium phosphate. And what you would be left with is a bone that's not very hard, but still very flexible. If you were to destroy the collagen, all right, you can do that just by boiling. So if you took the same bone and boiled it, you wouldn't remove the calcium, but you would destroy the collagen. And this bone would shatter because it has no flexibility. So this figure is trying to show you that bones are not just hard, rigid structures because of the calcium and the phosphate. They also have to have flexibility from having collagen in the bone. All right? Okay, let's stop there. Next video, we're going to pick up on compact and spongy bone. Take that just a little bit more in depth, and then we'll move on to other topics.